The Australian Financial Review.
Hi, Myriam. Thanks for coming on the podcast for our last episode of the year.
Thanks for having me, Lisa. It's great to be here.
Before we get going, can I ask you a question? How would you describe the Rear Window column for the uninitiated?
It covers everything that the paper covers, so politics, business, finance, and wealthy people. But it does it asking perhaps a slightly different question, which is just, who are these people? What are they getting out of it? What's their motivations? How are they interacting with each other? What are their histories?
Rear Window is consistently one of the Financial Review's best read columns.
It can often be a little bit investigative, a little bit digging through paperwork, but also just a little bit opinionated as well. It's not straight news.
It's been a busy year. Corporate scandals, questionable flight upgrades, and company founders in all sorts of trouble. And that has left the column with plenty of digging to do.
This year we've really learned something about the power of leverage, the power of owning a big chunk of your business, and power of being seen like the one superhero who everything rests on.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, we look back on 2024. Outgoing Rear Window editor Myriam Robin tells us about the megalomaniac trying to solve Australia's housing crisis, the column's biggest scoop, and the rebellion underway at the country's most exclusive clubs. It's Thursday, December 19. Myriam, there's so much to ask you about when looking back at 2024, but I wanted to start with a theme that picked up particularly toward the end of the year at the Financial Review, and that was the founder that companies just can't live without, no matter what they do. I'm talking here about WiseTech's Richard White and Mineral Resources founder Chris Ellison. Why can't shareholders live without them?
So I guess they're different stories, so they do have some commonalities. With Richard White, who is the founder of WiseTech, which does logistics software for shipping and stuff, it's basically something he brought on himself. So he tried to sue an ex-lover over a furniture bill, and essentially he tried to bankrupt her, and she went nuclear. And the issue with doing this was Richard White had a reputation as a Lothario for a really long time, and I think when Linda Rogan came forward, it prompted a lot of women to come forward about their experiences with him, and it sort of dovetailed together into this broader investigation about some of his relationships with female board members, his relationship within the business with one of the product managers, as well as some of his dealings with women who approached him for business advice. He would very quickly transition that into a come-on, basically. The sort of business relevance is that Richard White and a lot of people like him in the tech industry always talk about the importance of getting more women into tech. And I think trying to do that while having a culture where women are worried they're going to be hit on, or other people in the business are wondering, why did a woman get a promotion? Is it because she's sleeping with the founder and stuff like that? It actually creates quite a hostile environment for women. And I don't think the board has even now grappled with this. And, you know, they say our culture's great, everyone loves it here, this is all personal stuff. And they had an investigation that basically was quite narrowly framed and ended up clearing Richard White of anything.
I deeply regret the impact this recent media has had on the people around me, my family, friends, loved ones, the WiseTech team, and you, our shareholders.
But the fact of the matter is, I don't think there's really appetite for Richard White to go. He sort of moved sideways into this consultancy role. People who know a lot more about the business than me describe him as the one person who holds the business's future, who can work on products, who can roll out new features, who understands very well where WiseTech needs to go. He's like the Steve Jobs of logistics or something like that. So I don't think shareholders want him to go. I don't think the board wants him to go. He's still a major shareholder. This has been very uncomfortable for him, I'm sure, but I don't think we've seen the last of Richard White.
It's a real case of key man risk, and it's the same at Mineral Resources.
It is. So sort of similar to what's happened at WiseTech, Chris Ellison has now set a date for when he'll leave. But I think I'm skeptical about whether that will happen because I think, again, shareholders really want him to stay. So what happened at Mineral Resources, which is a sort of diversified mining company, a very entrepreneurial one with this larger-than-life founder, basically there was a Neil Chenoweth investigation that looked into dealings between Mineral Resources and a company that Chris Ellison and a number of his associates controlled overseas. This company was making commercial transactions with Mineral Resources that were very beneficial to it, making a lot of money, also not paying Australian tax to the extent that it should have. So basically it was making Ellison rich at the expense of A, his shareholders, and B, the tax office. He eventually settled with the tax office, but it emerged that this was part of a pattern. He has a lot of companies doing business with the company he leads that is ASX listed that has other shareholders. These dealings are not disclosed as related party dealings. Again, there was an investigation.
An internal company investigation found Chris Ellison failed to disclose he had a financial interest in a British Virgin Islands company that sold almost $4 million worth of mining equipment to Mineral Resources.
And some of the things in it were quite extraordinary.
I deeply regret the impact this has had on the business and our people. I can't stress enough how much I hate what I've done, and I want everyone to know I deeply regret that error in judgment that I made back there.
To the extent that there were Mineral Resources staff manning his yacht, for instance, his personal private yacht. So it's very hard to defend, and I think the board would have wanted to defend it, but didn't in the end very much. And they were just like, well, clearly this is unacceptable, and he feels very bad about it. And I think the reaction of a lot of shareholders, surprisingly, was, okay, we don't want to lose him. He's great. I mean, one of them was like, this guy, he's a magic capital allocator. He does something no one else can do. So who cares about $1 million here or a couple of 100,000 there? This is small change on a $1 billion company.
But Myriam, if those founders can do no wrong, there were certainly some chief executives who could do no right this year. And I'm thinking in particular of the supermarkets and the banks. Why were some of those bosses so beaten up?
I think they were beaten up because there is an exception to the rule here, which is that companies that have to convince not shareholders, but the broader public are really vulnerable because the broader public is really hurting right now. If you think of people like WiseTech or Mineral Resources as companies, they're not interfacing with the broad public. And the ones who are interfacing with the broad public have had quite a difficult year. So I think when you're saying that, you're talking particularly about Woolworths and
yes,
Brad Banducci.
Yes.
Yeah. So Woolworths' problems came to a head when early in the year, Brad Banducci, who was he's been the CEO for a long time, he walked out of a Four Corners interview and that was captured on tape.
Rod Sims, the former head of the ACCC, says that we have one of the most concentrated supermarkets in the world. Is he lying?
It's not true.
His words are that
Retired, by the way.
What prompted his walkout is that he said that Rod Sims, who's a big critic of the supermarket, was retired.
He retired 18 months ago. He's not...
Okay, can we take that out? Is that okay?
It sounded a bit mean-spirited, a bit snipey. He didn't like it. He clearly didn't feel like it reflected how he wanted to come across. So he asked the Four Corners team to cut the line. They refused, and he was like, are you serious? And he got very angry and he walked out.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I'm done, guys.
You're walking out, really?
No. Can we just talk to Brad for a sec?
And that was just TV gold. The thing is, it was compounded a couple of weeks later when he was in Parliament and he refused to explain what Woolworths' return on equity metric is when asked by Nick McKim of the Greens.
I have put it to you, I don't know, I've lost count, maybe a dozen times.
Senator, I've answered the question many times.
You have not answered the question, Mr. Banducci. Honestly, I'm not interested in your spin.
Mostly because he thought it was irrelevant and it wasn't a particularly good metric for assessing Woolworths' profitability. Now, the funny thing is Banducci is quite a well-regarded executive in the market and he's been crucified on the small stuff, but sometimes the small stuff confirms the big stuff for people. And I think what this confirmed is that the supermarkets are not on your side. They're raising prices. And that's just a reality of the cost of living crisis. In inflation really hurts people without bargaining power, which is most of the population. And I think the difficulty of being one of these customer-facing businesses also extended to the Commonwealth Bank this year.
A loud reaction to a quiet decision.
Don't they make enough money now? What do they have to rob us for?
Why should I have to pay $3 to make a withdrawal on my own money? It's ridiculous.
It's absolutely disgusting.
Just towards the end of the year, as everyone was getting into Christmas, tried to put a $3 withdrawal fee on some of its accounts.
Clearly, we've done a poor job of communicating aspects of this change for our customers. We're going to pause the changes that we announce and we're going to spend...
The interesting thing about the Commonwealth Bank is I don't think that they are a company that blithely does things or the CEO is, prone to misjudging the situation. Matt Comyn is a very, very careful operator. He's very close to Jim Chalmers. He's someone who generally is very capable of seeing 3 steps ahead. For some reason or other, there was a assessment made that this wasn't that big a deal. The accounts were low or no fee. People usually would actually save money on moving to them and they wouldn't be withdrawing all the time anyway. But there's just a huge aversion right now to a big corporate adding a fee on something people think should be free. You can't convince people that it's the time to do things in a slightly different way because it will be better off for them in the long run. They just don't want to pay and they can't afford to pay and they're just sick of having to pay more for everything. No one even heard the explanation. They were just like, this is wrong, take it off.
And as you rightly say, the focus on the banks and supermarkets is really due to that rising cost of living and the pressure on governments to respond, and having a corporate villain is quite handy in that response. But overlapping that issue, the rising cost of living, is the housing crisis and the really pressing need for more houses to meet demand and bring down prices. Now, NRL Chair and Racing New South Wales boss Peter V'landys has put forward his solution, in Sydney anyway, and it's landed him in a bit of hot water and given you lots to write about. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, basically what's happened with Peter V'landys, who is the head of both the NRL and Racing New South Wales, is that there's this thing called the Rosehill Racecourse. It's in Western Sydney, and the government wants to put 25,000 new houses there along with several metro stations.
Good evening. The fight for Rosehill Racecourse has descended into an explosive brawl with vicious allegations of harassment, bullying and smear campaigns.
And V'landys is happy to do this, he'll get a bit of money. He doesn't think it's essential to the code and its needs. A lot of people really disagree, particularly in the racing industry. And I think this is sort of such a classic issue because you have a power player.
Are you intimidating?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people know I'm a determined person.
Who is used to steamrolling and getting his own way.
What do you make of his comments you're a megalomaniac?
I am.
And who has a huge number of enemies. And we sort of argued in the column that, he's using his forces for good. For more housing, which by our estimation is more important, vitally important. And it's just become sort of this classic thing where there's all of this dirt falling on V'landys because of the way he does business. He's a very, very, very tough operator. And he is someone to whom normal rules usually don't apply. I mean, how is it possible that he heads up racing and the NRL? I mean, no one else would even try it, but he is effective at it. He seems to be very, very good at cultivating political patronage, media patronage. He's very aggressive against his competitors, and he's trying to force this housing through, but it's torn many, many stripes off him. Not from us, funnily enough, even though we have criticised him in the past for various things about the way he runs the racing industry, but I think we felt that sometimes you got to do extreme things to fix a housing crisis.
And Myriam, every year Rear Window breaks a few stories, gets a few scoops, and this year there was a standout. You and your fellow columnist Mark DiStefano broke the story of Gina Rinehart's portrait fiasco. How did you come to break that story? And how did Rinehart fare more broadly this year?
Yeah, so look, a lot of great things at the papers start with Kyla Lusikian, who's one of our editors, and he heard a whisper at a dinner party, basically. And my co-columnist Mark, who'd been doing a lot of reporting on Gina and her close relationships with other billionaires and federal politicians, so he chased it down. But I guess it is a story that really captured everyone's imagination because of what it says about Gina Rinehart.
In news from Down Under, a billionaire has called for the removal of an unflattering portrait of her from the National Gallery of Australia. The woman in question is a controversial Australian mining billionaire named Gina Rinehart, seen here.
This portrait that she was not happy with, it's not a flattering portrait.
But I mean, come on, how unflattering could this portrait possibly... Okay, I gotta say...
And it was part of a series of mostly unflattering caricatured portraits of prominent Australians by Indigenous artist Vincent Namatjira. Now, does Rinehart think she deserves a flattering portrait? Well, absolutely. So she's a patron of the swimming, of a lot of athletes who sing her praises. She pays her workforce very well, which I don't think a lot of people will necessarily realise. She's built her own mine. She pays huge amounts of taxes. So, you know, she would say, look, I'm a really great Australian, and why is everyone being so mean to me? I guess the counterpart is that this is a woman with right-wing political opinions. She pals around with Donald Trump. She has a very close relationship with Peter Dutton. She talks a lot about Australians' sense of entitlement. And also her father had some very unsavoury views about Aboriginal people, and she's never condemned those. And I think it just showed the break between how she sees herself and how she's seen in society more broadly. She's not thick-skinned, and she doesn't have a very good gauge, I think, of public opinion, maybe little respect for artistic impression. And then there were the issues of the appropriateness of her approach. So she had all of these swimmers who she's financially supported writing to the gallery, asking for the portrait to be taken down. There was the wrinkle of the fact that the gallery chair is Ryan Stokes, who's the son of Kerry Stokes, who is the West Australian billionaire who she is very close to. So none of it was subtle, but she isn't subtle. You know, whenever she wants something, she pulls absolutely every lever she has. She doesn't just want to ship iron ore and be very wealthy. She wants to change the nation, and she doesn't want to be a figure of ridicule in a public gallery.
Myriam, we're talking about the year in review, and as the outgoing editor of Rear Window, you're the perfect person to give us the rundown. Two big stories over the past few years for the Financial Review have been the PwC tax leak scandal and the unravelling of Qantas's status as a cultural and corporate icon. Why are both companies struggling to move on from these dramas?
I think in both cases we're really dealing with the dregs of the scandal. So with PwC, we know almost everything that happened. What we don't know is how far it went internationally. Now, if you remember what this is all about, it's PwC was busted using confidential Treasury information it has received through an industry consultation to plan and market a multinational tax scheme. Now, these schemes, by definition, they take place across multiple countries, and every PwC office would be very protective of its clients in that jurisdiction. So it's very hard to see how this would have ever happened just from PwC Australia. And that's not what happened. So there was a legal investigation that named several international PwC partners who were involved, but PwC Global refuses to release that report, and they've been asked for it from Parliament many, many times now, and it's just a complete roadblock, and it's not clear what else can be done to actually get it. PwC Australia, which Parliament can make things very difficult for, says it doesn't have it. That's probably true. And I think what we've learned this year is just the extent of how PwC Global took over the local operation to try and limit the fallout and keep it an Australian problem. So that included flying in a new CEO from Singapore, Kevin Burrows. And this year we revealed, but after he told partners, that he was actually paid $1.2 million a year, not counting bonuses, from PwC Global. That's on top of his PwC Australia salary. Now, he didn't tell his Australian reports about this or a parliamentary inquiry. Why would PwC Global be paying him? Well, surely so that he fulfills its wishes as well as that of the Australian entity. So there's a conflict of interest issues. So Is he here to represent the Australian firm, or is he here to help the global firm keep the scandal confined to Australia? PwC partners are furious about this payment. The parliamentarians who asked him for his pay a year ago and only got the Australian part of it are also furious about this. But it's not really clear how much more Australia's politicians can do about this situation. None of this is really to suggest that PwC Australia hasn't paid for this scandal. I think they've paid a lot. They no longer receive government business. It's been commercially very, very damaging. They had to actually sell their government business for $1 to a private equity firm. So there's been a very heavy financial price. But I think, as often happens in corporate scandals, the price is paid by every one of PwC's employees and partners. Is it paid by the people at the very top who made these decisions? Probably not. And I think, to some extent, culture is diffused and, responsibility bears on everyone a little. But I think it's always very hard to actually get the decision makers. And instead, the payment is just something that's borne by everyone.
Although Kevin Burrows did become the face of the scandal this year, I guess.
Yeah, no, he's but he is well paid for it. So
yeah. And what about Qantas?
Well, so like PwC, this year was where the Qantas reviews landed. So Richard Gorder, he stepped down as Qantas chairman, but before he did, he had to release a highly critical review of his own board's governance. We covered all of this extensively. I don't think anyone came out well. The board was very much on autopilot through the pandemic and the post-pandemic period. And there was also the issue of the Ghost Flights ACCC settlement, which was another historic issue that Qantas paid an absolutely massive fine over. But I guess from Qantas's point of view, it would have seen this as the year it put these things to rest, or it started putting the issues behind it, and there's been little fresh scandal. I think it's helpful at this point to I guess, distinguish between the factors that are just part of how Qantas has always operated and the factors that are the result of the disastrous decisions it took during the pandemic. So my former co-columnist, Joe Aston, he had a book that dealt with this. I think the thing that really caught the public's imagination out of Joe's book, The Chairman's Lounge, was the freebies to the Prime Minister. It was a very small part of the book, and as Joe makes clear, it wasn't something that Alan Joyce, the former CEO, invented. Qantas has been cozying up to the parliamentary class for basically decades, and it continues to do so. So I think as we close out 2024, Qantas is definitely humbled. It's probably going to improve customer service. It's not going to be as arrogant in its dealings with its workforce and with its customers. But it's also ending this period with far fewer viable competitors than ever. So this year we've had Rex collapse and we've had Bonza gone. Prices are still very high. If you look at the share of political travel that Qantas handles, so this is travel for parliamentarians, it's higher than ever. So it's clearly, that capture of the political class is growing, actually. And from a legal point of view, customers still have a really startling lack of rights when they buy an airline ticket, which is, I guess, the regulatory environment that this all took place in. So those aren't things that are a matter of the tone set by the CEO at the top. They're more systemic and they're more structural. And I don't think those things are getting better at all.
People loved reading about the Chairman's Lounge and the exclusive access, who was in, who was out, how it works. Exclusive clubs are never far from the Rear Window pages, and just in case listeners think these are obscure, stuffy clubs with old white men that no one cares about, the column you wrote on the full member list of the Australia Club in Sydney turned out to be one of the best read Financial Review stories of the year. What happened in Clubland this year?
These are very stuffy clubs full of white men, but also people do care about them a lot.
Yeah,
so
right.
I think it's, and that, I guess, speaks to the exclusivity and the prestige and the history and the glamour to some extent of these institutions. So these are elite institutions not open to the public. They're very hard to get into. It takes like a year at least. You have to be vetted by current members. Anyone can object to you joining. They're expensive to get into. So a lot of members tell me that club politics, it's a blood sport. And this year was as bloody as any. In Melbourne, we had a number of contested leadership elections in the major private members clubs. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but actually leadership contests aren't really done in clubland. It's not really seen as genteel, I guess. Generally, someone is anointed and they become the president. But this year there were quite a few tussles. a group of younger members overturned the old regime at the Savage Club, which is one of the more bohemian clubs, I guess. And that set the stage for a really bitter struggle at the Melbourne Australia Club, where, again, you could say the Young Turks won that dispute. Now, these clubs are male only, but I think it's helpful for listeners to understand some of the dynamics with the membership. A lot of the older members who joined these clubs when they were just a done thing, they're probably at the end of their careers, and they generally want women to join. They have impressive daughters. They want to leave a legacy, and often they're not particularly culturally conservative either, particularly for their age. But the 30-year-olds who join, they chose to join these institutions in an age where most of their people their own age would have joined a gym or a fancy health club. So they made a very specific decision to join a male-only institution, and they like the gender segregation. They want the gender segregation. They're not giving it up without a fight. This is what happened at the Sydney Australia Club, which in 2021 had a really highly public and excruciating vote on whether to allow female members. 62% of those who voted were opposed. So the list we got leaked is dated June 2023. So it's 2 years after that big fight that happened. And what was interesting, I guess, is that many of the people who were pushing really hard for allowing women in who lost the vote, they were still members on that list. What I think that speaks to is, I guess, the continuing relevance of that club for these people. They had a huge defeat. They don't want to walk away. I think it also means that this issue probably isn't entirely going away. There's still a lot of members at all these clubs who do want to make them gender neutral and
to change them from the inside.
Yeah, exactly. And then there was another issue we covered over the year at the Melbourne Club, which had a entirely different situation. So Alan Mayers, who's one of Melbourne's most prominent and wealthy barristers, and he's also just probably the most patrician, dignified man you can imagine, he resigned in a huff, which is not something people like him generally do. And he said it was because the club was racist. We eventually found out what happened there, and it turns out he'd supported the election of a Melbourne property developer and philanthropist called Jason Yeep, who was born in Malaysia. A lot of people at the club, and I spoke to a few in the wake of Myers' broadside, that basically were really offended that he would say this about the club. They say that not everyone in the club is white. It's a really welcoming, supportive place, and Yeep's race had nothing to do with why he wasn't admitted. But Myers doesn't believe them, and he actually wrote a really blistering letter that he sent to all of his contacts saying, I'm not going to be in an institution that discriminates on the basis of race. So I think that dispute and also the ongoing battles about women, they really highlight how these institutions are changing and what it means to be a member of Australia's elite, and whether these clubs should change with it. It's a really interesting contest, and I think it's something our readers can't get enough of reading about.
Myriam, after 7 years, you're moving on from the Rear Window column. How do you feel about that, and what's next? And can you put 2024 in context? How does this year compare or stand out from the rest?
Yeah, so I'm moving on. I joined in 2017, and I've had a ball working with first Joe Aston and now Mark DiStefano. Yeah, I guess Rear Window it's delightful how many things you get to cover, how broad it is, all the different people you get to speak to. People generally take the call and are willing to explain themselves, and it's been really fascinating. I've learned a lot about, I think, how the people who make financial and business decisions in Australia think. And if there's a negative, it's just that it's so frenetic. There's so much that we cover. There's a column space to fill every single day. There's a very high standard, and sometimes we reach it and sometimes we don't, but every day we're trying to, and that's a struggle as well. I'll miss it. You do get a bit addicted to the adrenaline in this role. You know, you have 1 or 2 bylines every single day, and you're trying to make a splash with every one of them. But, I've been offered a chance to write features full time, and that's always something I've really enjoyed doing, and it'll give me a chance to sit with things for longer, to really think about them, to interview more widely, to consider more perspectives, and I hope it'll still use the skills I've learned in Rear Window, and I'm really looking forward to it. In terms of how this year's compared to other years, well, it felt busier, There's been sort of all of the issues around the founders. There's been all this stuff we haven't even mentioned, like the slow-moving crisis that is Star Entertainment. There's been all of these wash-up of stories that really are just so complicated and went in all these different directions, like PwC and Qantas. And this year we've really learned something about the power of leverage, the power of owning a big chunk of your business, and the power of being seen like the one superhero who everything rests on. And I think some people have survived things that frankly is surprising. That's been a really fascinating and interesting thing to see.
Well, I hope you enjoy your break. We'll miss you on Rear Window, but we'll look forward to your longer features. Thanks, Myriam.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Myriam Robin reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gao, Lap Fan and Martin Peralta. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gao. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. This is our last episode for 2024. We'll take a short break and be back with you on January 16 for our summer series. See you next year.
The Australian Financial Review.